This episode of the Cult Popture podcast was brought to you by our Patreon. If you want to tell us which films we should watch, get up to 2 extra exclusive podcasts a month, give us something to talk about in the post-credit scenes at the end of each episode, or even contribute to the discussion in the episode itself, then please consider joining the cult and donating at www.patreon.com/cultpopture. Wow, they said we were gone. We told everyone we're taking a break.
They said we were gone because we explicitly told them we were.
But we're back. We're back because film franchise Fortnights is not dead. Richard, welcome back, everybody, to Film Franchise Fortnights on the Cult Popture podcast. This is a podcast where Richard and myself, AJ, for the last half a decade, have been covering and watching and discussing different film franchises. And for what we realized well after choosing the subject for this episode, could be seen as our first Easter special, considering this is the last film franchise Fortnights that will come out before Easter Sunday. We are going to be covering the 4 films in the faith-based Pure Flick series, God's Not Dead. So now we can officially say that we've covered every franchise from Godzilla to Godfather to God's Not Dead.
Nice.
I'm printing it on shirts. I'm putting it on our Facebook banner. Like, we can now have that as our selling point.
It'll be like, Godzilla's Not Dead, Father. In like a mashup of fonts.
Whoa!
Someone Photoshop that. I expect this. When the podcast gets posted at midnight New Zealand time, I expect that photoshopped by 1 a.m. New Zealand time.
Would it not be more of a Richard-style joke to remove the word God from the combination phrase?
Right, so it's like, Zilla Father's not dead.
Father Zilla's not dead. Yeah, like it's like the entire reason we're throwing them together has been removed. If you, the audience, if we the people, have never heard of this,
we the people.
we are we the people. If you've never heard of this franchise, you may be wondering why we're delving into the cheaply made and almost exclusively terrible realm of Christian movie franchises. Because as a podcast, we predominantly cover franchises in the mainstream. It's very rare that we'll like consider doing anything that isn't like, you know, known by most people, or, you know, outside of a specific niche. But there's something special about God's Not Dead and its 3 sequels, God's Not Dead 2, God's Not Dead, A Light in Darkness, and God's Not Dead, We the People, in that these movies have been criticized over the years for being so mind-numbingly terrible, flagrantly offensive, obtusely self-important, frustratingly ignorant, and unintentionally hilarious, with a persecution complex so visceral the film transcends the invisible to the mainstream world of Christian media and is often listed amongst some of the best so bad it's good movies ever made. This franchise is to faith-based media what something like Gangnam Style was to K-pop, or Squid Game was to Korean dramas. The fact that they're both Korean is a coincidence, and I'm not speaking that on quality, more just that it's media like from a niche
of K-pop.
Yeah, right.
It's media. Use Gangnam Style as an example.
Yeah. Well, what's a better example? What do you think? Like media that has broken forth from its niche into the zeitgeist.
Yeah, it's like, I'm glad you've heard of it, but it's probably not the one I'm proudest of.
In many ways, you could call God's Not Dead outsider art. You know, like non-mainstream artistic endeavors that have a very specific message that they're trying to put across to the world. Now, God's Not Dead has been covered by dozens of other podcasts before, but perhaps what gives our show, what gives Cult Popture a potentially unique perspective is that I grew up pretty Christian before leaving the church when I was in my early 20s. I'd never seen these movies before watching them for the podcast, but I did grow up feeling conflicted and being unable to marry my love for film with faith-based movies, which are always so garbage, Richard. These are some of the better ones to get.
What's your favourite face-based movie?
Face-based?
Face Off?
It'd be The Dark Knight. Two-Face. So, as is the case with a lot of ex-Christians such as myself as well, I harbour a lot of resentment and have several personal hang-ups and various collections of baggage with the religion, many of which will probably fuel the fire with which I judge these movies. Would you like to share maybe a little context for your standing in the world of faith and Christianity?
Yeah, it's interesting because I sort of know somewhat just from talking during the week our relationship with these films, and I feel like I'm going to come across as a lot more sympathetic. But when it comes to the idea of religion, like, I probably think religion is stupider than you do. But yeah, I've never been religious. I understand why people are religious, and I think that religion as a concept is fascinating. But it's not even something I necessarily would define myself as like an atheist or agnostic or anything like that. It's just I don't see the need to define my relationship with God or a lack thereof, because it's not something I've ever really thought about. Like, there was never a time in my life where I felt a void that I thought only religion could fill. There was a time when I was a kid, I asked my mum, "Hey, are we religious?" And she said, "Do you want to be?" And I said, "I don't know." And that was kind of my experience with religion. There was a brief period of time where I applied for a Catholic school that was, you had to like interview for it and stuff like that. And yeah, I sort of was willing to commit to learning Catholicism and pretending to be Catholic. Because I think because my mum was raised Catholic, that I was, through that I was able to be considered somewhat Catholic enough to get an interview, but
it's like race, like your race, your ethnicity.
Yeah.
Well, that is really interesting. I think that what is unique about God's Not Dead as well, in context of all this, is that when the first one came out, the kind of joke about it was like, this is just as offensive to atheists as it is to Christians. Like, so many Christians, and we'll get to some opinions later in the episode, absolutely hate these movies. Being an ex-Christian, I hate them, but I can tell you with full assurance, if I were still Christian, or if I'd seen these when I was Christian, I would still very much hate them. So this is not, that part of me hasn't changed. I think I can still see things that I detest in these movies that would have still bothered me when I was a believer. So, the first film in the series is called God's Not Dead. I know you're thinking he is dead,
well,
Richard.
yeah, it's called God's Dead, isn't it? That's the title that comes up on screen.
No, but then it very quickly says not before you can take a photo of it saying God's Dead and upload it to your Instagram.
That sounds like something you might have done.
So this was directed by a guy named Harold Cronk, which is a very fun name.
The Cronkman.
The Cronkman. Pull the lever, Cronk. And by the lever, I mean direct this film. It's based on a book called God's Not Dead, Evidence for God in an Age of Uncertainty by Pastor Rice Brooks. And it's also presumably based on the song God's Not Dead by a Christian mum rock band, the Newsboys, whom I've seen perform live. And it is also not based on, but a poorly understood rebuttal to the Nietzsche idea that God is dead.
Yeah, and also it's interesting because the God's Not Dead song that you said, you saw these guys live. I was completely unfamiliar with the song until 10 days ago when you told me, it's a song and the guys are in the movie. Because for the last fucking, how long have we known each other? Like the last like 6 years of this podcast at least. Whenever God's Not Dead has come up, you've said, he is surely alive. And I always assumed this was scripture and that you were quoting the Bible to me. But no, it was
peace be with you and also with you.
Yeah, and like people in the Discord have referenced God's Not Dead. He is surely alive. And then just recently in the last couple of weeks when we decided we were going to do God's Not Dead, you started adding some shit about a lion, and I was like, okay, well, this is definitely scripture then.
God is not dead. He is surely alive. He's living on the inside, roaring like a lion. The Newsboys, who are the band that perform the song, they also have. So there's two bands. There's Newsboys and DC Talk, and I think Newsboys used to have a different lead singer, but now the lead singer of DC Talk is the lead singer of Newsboys. And so they have a collection of very famous, very memeable Christian rock songs, including things like one called Breakfast in Hell, which is
Nice.
like, it sings about Captain Crunch, and the hook line in the chorus is, when the big one finds you, let the song remind you that they don't serve breakfast in hell. So of all the
They
reasons
don't.
to become Christian, the lack of breakfast.
Well, they would certainly convert Walt Jr.
DC Talk also have a very famous Christian song I remember from back in the day called Jesus Freak, in which the chorus proudly proclaims, people say I'm strange, does that make me a stranger? My best friend was born in a manger.
You've told me that lyric before. I remember, when we sort of first started the podcast, when you were still very religious.
I was not very religious, for the record. We started this podcast in 2016, which is when I would have probably still said I was Christian, but was in a steep decline in the past couple of years.
Yeah.
I haven't been a practicing Christian since when this movie came out in 2014.
Yeah. Well, because you stopped practicing because you perfected it.
I'd perfected Christianity, much like these movies did. What do you think God's Not Dead has on Rotten Tomatoes?
It'd be low double digits.
It's interesting. It's got a 12% critic score, but it does have a very different audience score. Would you like to guess what that audience score was? 75%, but there is one. I'll give you a little sizzle. One of these movies has a 100% audience score on Rotten Tomatoes, which is funny because I looked at some of the audience reviews and I could still only find bad ones. Like, so the first review was like, utter filth, this should be destroyed. And can you tell me, this might be a bit of a difficult question, but can you tell me what the movie's about? It's a series of converging storylines. It's Love Actually or Crash reminiscent. Atheism Actually.
God actually is dead. Starts with Hugh Grant at the airport. If you look around, you'll see that God actually is dead.
Which is what Nietzsche was saying, that this movie misinterprets as being like a literal statement.
Yeah, so this guy, our main character, Josh, starts... His
name is obviously Josh Wheaton, which sounds very close to Joss Whedon, yet another reason why these movies are cancelable.
Yeah, he starts at college and enrolls in a philosophy class taught by Professor Jeffrey Radisson, who is an atheist, or is he? We'll get to that. And
he's played by...
we'll get to it. Played by Kevin Sorbo from Hercules. He's the guy that says disappointed, if you've seen that.
Yes,
clip.
And he also very loud and proud conservative Trump supporter.
Yeah, one of these, the mask mandates are Nazi Germany kind of guys.
Yeah.
But anyway, so in his philosophy class, he talks about Nietzsche's idea, God is dead, and he demands that his students write on a piece of paper and sign it saying God is dead, and Josh is the only one who refuses, and then the Professor Radisson says, all right, you get 3 classes that you get to teach. You're going to give us 3 lectures to prove to us that God is not dead. Otherwise, I'm going to fail you. And the rest of the students will decide the winner. In the first 2 debates, Radisson trounces him.
Smokes him.
But then in the last one, Josh says to Radisson, why do you hate God? And he breaks down, revealing that he's not an atheist, he's a misotheist, meaning he believes in God but resents God, which we'll get to it. It's actually kind of an interesting character choice. Yeah, he hates God because his mum died, and that, how can someone who was all good do this? Meanwhile, as well, one of the other sort of converging storylines, we have a character called Reverend Dave, who's like a cool youth pastor, who plays he's like the pastor. They've got like the local church for the university essentially, and Josh confides in him about his spirituality and stuff and what he's going through. But yeah, so Josh, eventually the rest of the class agrees that God is not dead, and they all go to a Newsboys concert and they're celebrating, and Radisson is like, oh, I'm gonna reconcile with my wife, and he runs.
Who's Christian? His wife was girlfriend Mina is Christian, who wants to break up with him.
And he runs to go tell her, and he gets hit by a car and is dying in the middle of the street. And Reverend Dave comes up to him and is like, listen, the reason you didn't die immediately is so that you have a chance to let Jesus back into your heart. And then he's like, I believe, and then he dies.
Yeah,
and also Dean Cain is in the movie as like an atheist businessman who's more of a he's a less sort of like he's a less complex character than Kevin Sorbo's character. When you talk about the sort of the atheist straw man, I think Kevin Sorbo is at the start is a lot like the evil one, but then it sort of gets into at the end it's like all atheists don't actually like just disagree with God, whereas like Dean Cain's character is a lot more like he's the evil businessman, and his storyline is like almost completely removed and unresolved.
Nothing happens.
Yeah.
So Dean Cain's character's name is Mark. He is the brother of Mina, who is Kevin Sorbo's secret Christian girlfriend. His storyline is basically he refuses to see his elderly mother, who is dying of dementia, and when he does finally see her, she delivers some kind of monologue which makes him think about his life. And then there's also
like a Muslim character in Josh's class.
She's named Aisha.
And she wants to convert to Christianity, but her father won't let her. And
doesn't know. And when he finds out, he beats her up.
Yeah, he beats the shit out of her and disowns her.
And finally, Dean Cain's character is Mark. His girlfriend's name is Amy, who is a left-wing blogger who finds out she has cancer. These are the chess pieces on which we move our story forward, our game of chess with our players, I should have said, and it's a stage. That's a much better comparison. God's Not Dead is our second Shane Harper franchise. He plays Josh Wheaton in this film, and he also briefly appeared as a principal dancer in High School Musical 2. So there's our lone connection to any other franchises. Richard, what did you think of this film? What did you think of it?
Okay, so again, like I said, I'm going to come across as sympathetic, I think, to these films, more so than you. And this isn't to say I liked the film. I didn't. However, I think I sort of committed to meeting at least the first film on its own terms, knowing and kind of assuming that they would get worse, especially when the last one is called We the People. It has the main, this poster has a silhouette of a character standing in front of the Washington Monument. It came out in 2021. It's like, take a fucking wild guess what this is going to be about. But so God's Not Dead, I was like, okay, I want to actually like try and appreciate this film for what it is trying to be. And so I was like, it was one classic, movie where I'm like, this isn't the worst thing I've ever seen. And to me, the idea of a student being told to do something in their class and saying, it goes against what I believe to do that. And then you present 3 lectures to the class and try and convince the class of your belief. Like it's 12 Angry Men essentially, and like converting the unconvertible,
and just as good.
but it is like that's an interesting plot. It's fun to follow a character who is so steadfast in their beliefs that is able to convince someone who's denying their beliefs. And so it's like it's a bad movie, don't get me wrong, but for what it's trying to be, I think this does it a lot better than certainly 3 and 4 do.
Right.
And I thought Kevin Sorbo like actually played his character pretty well.
That's the nice thing I can say about this film is I actually thought Kevin Sorbo was pretty good in
Yeah.
this movie. And all the films in the series have this fun little quirk where they include like common atheist talking points. Like it's clearly the writers have like Googled like what do atheists always say, or even just from experience. What have atheists always said to me when I've debated them? And so they include them in the dialogue, but when they include them in the dialogue, they end up being far more convincing and compelling arguments than anything any of the Christians say in the movie. Like you
there's
messaged
one
me
line,
about
when Kevin Sorbo says that God was a useful fairy tale to explain the unexplainable, thousands of years ago, or hundreds of years ago, that things like earthquakes, lightning, stuff that we didn't know the scientific explanations for, it was easier back then to attribute it to, benevolent God. But and I was like, that's an argument I've never really heard. Like, I haven't heard that explanation of why the myth of God was created. And I was like, yeah, that's a fucking good point. Thank you, God's not dead. For
compared to when before they have their official like showdown, they're having a private argument, and Professor Radisson is like, I begged God to save my mother, and Josh goes, sometimes God's answer is no. And like we're just supposed to be like, oh, cool, great, like, oh, that's fine.
Oh, your mum was
not
actually a horrible person, Kevin Sorbo.
The film also has a cameo from one Willie Robertson, the host of duck hunting reality show Duck Dynasty, who uses his cameo to not only preach his Christian faith, but also justify why he thinks it's okay to eat meat. He has a confrontation with Amy, the liberal vlogger. And I thought this was hilarious that as it tosses like the not even inherently Christian idea or anti-Christian idea of vegetarianism onto the pile. Like, of all the things this movie is condemning, it also condemns vegetarianism for some reason, even though you could make the whole movie and not even broach that subject. And it's just really embarrassing because he basically is given a platform in the movie where we all have to sit and just listen to him talk about how he respects the ducks that he shoots and all this weird stuff.
Yeah, it's reminiscent of the first episode of film franchise Fortnights, where we discussed Lethal Weapon and the moment in Lethal Weapon 4 where the movie stops so that Chris Rock can do a Type 5
that's right,
on cell phones.
Yeah, this is like a Type 5 if Type 5s weren't funny, which is what going to church actually is. That's what a sermon feels like, Richard, is you're watching a stand-up comedian who doesn't tell very many jokes.
Yeah, well, this is like, one of my sort of biggest exposures to the world of religion was I went to workmates, a very religious workmates wedding, and there's a lot of talk, and this is one of the things that really creeps me about religion, and we experienced this when we covered Yes, God, Yes, for the short films adapted to feature-length films, which is set in a very sort of religious place. That during the wedding, there's a lot of talk about like, the parents of the bride, please stand up. Do you give your daughter to submit to her husband and to obey his commands? And I'm like, this is like kinky as fuck, and it's you should not be saying this in front of a group of people. It's either like it's gross for like one of two reasons, and either way they should not be said in a house of worship. And so there's a lot of things like that in these films where there's talk of submission, and it's just a very strange thing. The other thing about that, why I brought it up, is the minister was this cool
Reverend Dave.
The Reverend, the Reverend Dave of the wedding was.
Oh, sorry, you.
Talking about my real life experience. The Reverend Dave of this wedding was like doing a Type 5 about marriage. Type 5 is a comedy term to refer to like a 5-minute set that you've got that's your tightest 5-minute set. And he was talking about like, now in a marriage, the man is kind of makes the rules and talking about why they talk about submission and how the wife submits to the man. And he's like, now that's not the way it is in my household, but like talking about how
classic.
Like these things, it's like, religiously, the man is the provider in the family. Now, don't let my wife hear you say that. And like mixing in worship with like 90s stand-up comedy
Yeah.
about
I get almost Chris Rockian stand-up.
Yeah.
So, Rich, I wanted to ask you, like, having never really watched a faith-based movie before, I know you've watched one, which we could talk about if you'd like. What was your, did you notice a separation between what
church and state.
church and state, what faith-based movies look like, and what even regular bad movies look like?
It's interesting. The actual, like, if we're talking purely aesthetic, faith-based movies look exactly like bad movies.
Yep. They look like porn where the opposite of porn happens.
Yeah. That's a budget thing, to be fair. Like it's just the main thing is lighting, though. I mean, you creative cinematography, but there's with certain cameras can only achieve so much, and when you're having to light things a certain way. But and when you're not and also you also don't have the time to be super creative with your cinematography. There are a couple of cool shots across the franchise, I'll admit. There's one particularly cool cut, I thought, in the fourth one, that I messaged you about, and I was like, gotta hand it to them. That was a good piece of filmmaking.
Hey, that's exactly what it's like being Christian, where you suffer through bullshit for so long and occasionally have these like fleeting moments of fulfillment that are gone
when God talks to you.
Yeah, when God talks to you, because he's not dead.
As someone who's left the church, are you able to now admit that any time you claimed to have spoken to God, it was made up?
I wasn't a big speaking to God guy, but I did, quote, get drunk on the Holy Spirit quite a few times, which I now look back on with cold shame.
And realize it was just alcohol.
I wish. A couple of years ago, I think it was like 2016, 2017, right when I was like right in the midst of questioning my faith, I shared with you the only faith-based movie I've ever seen that I think is marginally decent. It's an adaptation of a book called Blue Like Jazz. And you watched it, and if memory serves correct, you weren't like jazzed on it, but you weren't like...
I wasn't too blue.
You know what I mean? And I think if anyone's seen Blue Like Jazz, I think the difference between God's Not Dead and Blue Like Jazz, a movie which I don't necessarily stand by anymore, is that Blue Like Jazz is deeply, deeply sympathetic towards atheists, whereas this feels like it is deeply, deeply sympathetic towards the hard life that mostly white Christians in America must lead.
I would say, I think the difference, like, I don't remember Blue Like Jazz all that well, if I'm being perfectly honest with you, but I would say, what I felt with the difference, I don't remember it being sympathetic to atheists, for example, but I remember Blue Like Jazz as more of a coming of age film, that the way he came of age happened to be rekindling his faith. It's like you've still then got you've got the coming of age storyline, and that's still at least compelling in the same way that, to a lesser extent, that I still found the convincing others of your steadfast beliefs to be an interesting idea. It's there's so much other stuff in the film that it's like. And the second one does this even more so, where it's like, you're actually toying with what could be a really good film.
They're on the other side of a good argument, but they're on the losing side, but they don't realize they're on the losing side. And it's like, well, you brought it up. If I was you, I wouldn't have brought this up.
To be fair, though, I think that if the film was reversed and it was an atheist going into a fucking church class and be like, no, I'm going to write God is dead on this piece of paper, and I'm going to stand up and convince you why that is, I think that's a less interesting film.
Sure. Because it's attack instead of defense.
That's a good way of putting it. That it's an attack, and also it's like, you're right. You're obviously right. So it's like it should be less interesting to convince people. It's like convincing people, and same thing with 12 Angry Men, that these people are so convinced, but you're just giving them doubt. The film Doubt plays this as well. That like convincing people to doubt something, because obviously, you know, the burden of proof is beyond reasonable doubt. That, yeah, whereas like I'm convincing you with facts that God does not exist, that's not as interesting, because anyone could just read a book and see, of course, he's not real.
Anyone could read a book, and why not the good book? As indicated by its Rotten Tomatoes score, the film was almost unanimously negatively received, with many calling it out for its, as we said before, its straw man arguments and unrealistic characters. It's basically the end result of a Christian thinking about what he should have said to that atheist during the argument he had with him the other day, right? And I think what's more telling are its Christian detractors. So there's plenty of like Christian criticism of these films. Evangelical columnist Michael Gerson referred to the film as lacking grace, and in a Washington Post article wrote, "The main problem with God's Not Dead is not its cosmology or ethics, but its anthropology. It assumes that human beings are made out of cardboard. Academics are arrogant and cruel. Liberal bloggers are preening and snarky. Unbelievers disbelieve because of personal demons. It is characterization by caricature." So basically saying, of course the Christians win, because Christians are writing the atheist characters.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. Which is why, like, it toys with the fact that Kevin Sorbo is a more interesting character, because he was once faith-based, you know? Rather than just being like, no, God's not real because of science.
So obviously I thought this film was awful, and while on a personal level, I'm somewhat triggered by familiar behaviors and beliefs I grew up tolerating or even buying into, I think the most damning thing I could say about this movie is I thought it was incredibly mean-spirited and, like, heartless. You hear it's a movie about a Christian student and an atheist professor, and you think, oh, it's just going to be an adaptation of the typical The Professor Sat Down copy-pasta from Christian social media circles.
Everybody clapped.
Everybody clapped. Or the more famous example of this is actually, and that student... Albert Einstein. That's what this is from, right? That's and which is also untrue. Albert Einstein, I don't think that's a true story about Albert Einstein. But the film doesn't end with the atheist professor converting, which feels like the natural place to take the story. It instead like calls for blood, and as you said before, it ends with him getting hit by a car and suffocating as his lungs are filled with blood. Reverend Dave supposedly converts him as he dies, which seems to answer the "if I just ask for forgiveness on my deathbed" question with an emphatic "Yep, that's fine." As a film, it's also basically punishing him for being, I thought, like, understandably atheist. Like, he's got a wound that needs healing, and they make you sympathize with him because of the loss of his mother.
And also, it's like that unanswerable thing, like you said, the argument of, like, sometimes God just says no, and it's like, no, you need to provide a better argument.
That's not a very good ending. Radisson is presented as an asshole in ways outside of religion throughout the film, like he's very controlling of his secret Christian girlfriend and all these other things which make him a straw man, bad person. But in killing him, it's basically the author saying, atheists deserve to die, with a big smile and their arm round your shoulder.
Yeah. And also just the way it's framed in the movie is like, the whole movie has been, and because also I think that the whole idea of the movie, or like if you ask the writer, is that like Josh doesn't hate Professor Radisson, and you know that he feels sorry for him, if anything, and then Kevin Sorbo's lying, like dying, drowning in in his own blood in the middle of the road. Cut to God's not dead. Everyone just they're literally
jarring.
partying while he's dying.
Yeah. As Reverend Dave coaches him through conversion, as he again fucking dies, he encouragingly says to Radisson, this is a direct quote from the movie, "Don't worry, in a few minutes you'll know more about God than I do or anybody else here." Terrifying thing to be told moments before death. And if someone tells me, "Don't worry, you're about to meet God," I'd be like, "Oh fuck, man, I don't want to fucking die. Like it's presented like it's like this piece of closure
You'll
or this
get your
beautiful.
answer.
Yeah, you'll get your answer. He's choking on his own goddamn blood. What are we talking about?
Literal goddamn blood.
After Radisson completes choking on his own blood, Reverend Dave, now just as chipper as he was before he watched a man die, is joined by his pastor friend Reverend Jude, who has been encouraging him to stay positive and faithful for the whole film. And while standing on the blood-stained road, exclaims, "What happened here tonight is a cause for celebration. Pain, yes, just for a few moments. But now, think about the joy in heaven." This comes moments after Radisson's dying words, quote, "I can't die, I'm not ready, and I don't want to die, I'm so scared."
Yeah.
I can tell you, Richard, having lived as a Christian, it's easier to care about your conversion quota than the actual reality of the lives you're impacting. Right? You go, I converted. Yeah. My presence in my friends' lives has made them all Christian. And you don't then go, their lives suck. Their lives are fucking terrible. You just go, at least I got them. Then
you met me and I was unconvertible. And that's why you left the church.
My hero. I can't imagine this ending being narratively satisfying to even the most like hardcore Christians. Like, why do you have to fucking die?
That's the thing, yeah. Like, it's bad storytelling that you then cut to your main character partying.
Yeah. It is soulless, it is evil. When he got hit by the car, I was expecting him to recover through the power of faith and that be the way he finds God and learns to move past his mother's death. But instead the film tells you to be okay, as we said before, with God sometimes saying no and sometimes cutting life short, and you should in fact be grateful that an all-powerful God even fucking notices and responds to your pathetic, sinful self. To once again quote Reverend Dave as he converts dying Professor Radisson, "That car could have killed you instantly, but I'm sure right now you probably wish it did, but I'm here to tell you that it's
because
a gift.
You're drowning in your own fucking blood."
Because the God you don't believe in has given you another chance to change your final answer. This chance lasts about 40 extra seconds until he dies anyway. The ultimate indictment, I think, of God's Not Dead, I think, is that because it's written from the genuine perspective of a Christian, God as a character is entirely absent from the movie, because if you're a Christian, you can't assume the ways of God. That would be blasphemy, right? You can't write God as a character. And so not only does the atheist die, but the left-wing blogger with cancer, even after being prayed for by the newsboys themselves, is not cured of cancer. At least not in this film. And I think this is because if you're writing about the authentic and genuine experience of being a Christian, you can't just say, and God healed her cancer. And you can't just say God had him survive getting hit by a car, because you never actually see miracles happening in real life as a Christian, Richard. And you never see miracles happening in real life because God is dead. Because he's not real. The movie exists as if God isn't real.
Yeah. This is like, it's the God equivalent of a Santatheist movie.
Yeah, an atheist movie. Other than these moments, I thought the most authentic portrayal of life as a Christian shown in the film is how fucking lame Christian rock concerts are. Like, it's like it's a sin to be excited, so everyone's just sort of like standing, bobbing in place, clapping their hands and raising their arms. It sucks. I hate everything about this movie.
And also, so this film as well, like at the concert, which I'm sure is a thing that happens at actual concerts, the lead singer of Newsboys encourages everyone to pull out their phones, and you go, he's going to do like instead of lighters, you use your phone torch. He's like, no, now text everyone you know and say, God's not dead. And then when the film ends, it says, no, actually do it. That wasn't just part of the movie. Like, this is real. Actually do it.
If I texted everyone in my contacts, God's not dead, not only would I get no conversions, I'd probably lose clients. Like, it's a bad move, and you shouldn't do it.
I briefly thought about doing that as like a piece of content and reading out the replies.
Right.
But I don't have the fucking balls to do that. I don't want to like girls I went on one date with 7 years ago whose names are just still randomly saved in my phone because who deletes contacts, you know?
exactly what I was thinking. Is like I have obscure fucking numbers in my phone.
like people that like people that I'm sure like your people I worked with 10 years ago, and it's like I hope you've deleted my number so that this is just a random number and not why the fuck is this dude messaging me. I should go through and clean up my contacts.
That's the real lesson.
Like people I
dead.
bought a car off who I saved their number.
Is there any other points you'd like to make about the first film?
Is there any points I want to make about the first film? No,
we have got our new segment. If you'd like to move straight to that.
we have spoken for 40 minutes already about it, which is
well. Before we move on from the first film, I thought we'd go into franchise, as in WHYS. This is our new segment where we speculate as to why this film got so many sequels. Why was this turned into a franchise? And why do you think? Do you have any theories?
Well,
there's nothing
one thing
too
I
concrete.
know is that this was actually surprisingly a box office hit. That it's for a budget of $2 million, it grossed $64.7 million, finishing third behind two films we've covered, Divergent and Muppets Most Wanted.
And it also made God's Not Dead briefly the second highest grossing faith-based film of all time, behind Passion of the Christ, which does that count? It's still very much a Hollywood film. But this title of second highest grossing faith-based film of all time lasted a little less than a month before it was beaten by a film called Heaven is for Real. It is now the 8th highest grossing faith-based film of all time, behind other such classics as Son of God, Miracles from Heaven, War Room, I Can Only Imagine, and The Shack. And none of the other sequels grossed higher than this one.
Yeah, it's interesting that none of, like, I've not heard of any of those.
The Shack is a very famous book in Christian circles. I've read it, and to all the Christians listening...
Is it more famous than the Bible?
Yeah, it is. To all the Christians listening who have read The Shack, I think The Shack fucking sucks, and I thought that when I was a Christian. So stop just assuming it's good because you're a Christian and it's something you can consume.
Yeah.
but the best Christian media is VeggieTales, and that's it. There's nothing else.
Anyway, for the why of the franchise is that you have a guy called David A.R. White who portrays Reverend Dave, who owns the production company that makes these films. And so he obviously liked his character. He thought they did something pretty good. So he was like, you know what? I'm going to make 3 more sequels where I'm the only character who is in all 4 of them.
And I will kill off several around me to be that lone character.
That'd be a good plot for the film. That like it gets revealed that he's actually been killing these people. He was driving the car. That's how he got to Kevin Sorbo so quickly. And he was like, "Oh, you don't believe in God, huh? You're about to.
God's not dead, but you are." God's Not Dead 2 came out in 2016, once again directed by the Cronkman himself, Harold Cronk. What do you think it has on Rotten Tomatoes?
7.
It's got 10% critic score, but a 61% audience score.
Hell yeah.
This one is once again follows a series of converging storylines. Would you like to rattle through them, and I'll pick up on any you have understandably forgotten?
This one I only remember as having one storyline. So, and also just for the record, I turned over a new leaf this year and decided to pay more attention to film franchise Fortnite films. And I did that for 3 out of 4 of these. So the God's Not Dead 2 is the main storyline. It stars Melissa Joan Hart, who you might know as Sabrina the Teenage Witch. Now she's what's her character's name? Grace the middle-aged Christian. And she's a teacher, and one of her students is sort of is being closed off because her brother died recently, and they have a chat outside of work hours where she mentions Christianity, etc., and it perks her up a little bit, the student. And then in class later on, they're talking about figures like Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King, and their sort of peaceful teachings and ideals. And the very same student, Brooke, says, oh, essentially, like, yeah, this is like what Jesus said, right? And then Melissa Joan Hart's character is like, yeah, that's right, and Jesus also said this. And then
Jesus went on to say,
yeah. And then, boom, one of the students texts their parents and says, they're shoving God down our throats.
the PTA is after your ass.
And then, yeah, so people, the principal says, hey, you can't mention God in this. Hey, this is a school, God damn it. And she ends up saying,
Sorry.
no, actually, this is wrongful expulsion, and ends up going to court and trying to fight for her right not only to party but to mention Jesus at school, because there's this whole thing, separation of church and state, which I'm sorry, America, I don't really understand it that much, and so I don't like one of these things. I was thinking the other day, there's real funny about, like, someone on the Discord said, oh, I wonder how much in New Zealand they're taught about some American piece of history, and it's like, I wonder how much you're taught about the Treaty of Waitangi. Probably not a lot, because you don't give a shit. And why would we give a shit about your American shit?
Because we don't get taught a lot about it either.
Yeah, true. But that's changed, though, in the last couple of years.
Fair enough.
But yeah, I mean, we're not, America's not as much the center of the universe as I think these films and
God apparently thinks.
God would like us to believe. But anyway, they... in the prosecution are like trying to prove again God is dead, so that this is still a relevant title for the franchise. But the way that they decide to structure their defense is that proving that Jesus, outside of religion, did actually exist as a person. And so because this was a history class, she should be allowed to mention Jesus as a historical figure. Now, I think that is a fantastic setup for a film or an episode of a TV show, maybe not a whole film. But and then obviously, they prove that Jesus existed, and the way they prove it, I'm sure using actual facts and figures, because I think that it's fascinating to look at. Most people agree someone resembling Jesus actually existed, and looking at, okay, well, what actually happened in his life that was twisted into what we know as the myth of Jesus. I think that's fascinating. I think that when that happened in the film, when they had that realization and they bring witnesses in just to prove the existence of Jesus, I was like, what a great setup for a film. I'm sorry.
Sure.
But the film, again, is not good. But I wanted to meet like I said, I wanted to meet the first film on its own terms. And so I gave it 2 stars on Letterboxd, being like, well, there's going to be a steady decline. And then I was like, well, this one's better than the first one. I thought it was kind of a more straightforward storyline. We didn't waste as much time on, other storylines. It was more this kind of, this a courtroom drama, and it's similar to Blue Like Jazz, where you've at least got the coming of age storyline or story structure. Here you've at least got a courtroom drama, which I'm a sucker for a courtroom drama. I'm a big Legally Blonde fan.
Sure. I do agree with what you're saying, that there is kind of like a tiny nugget of brilliance in the film of like, they have to prove that God exists as a historical, or Jesus existed as a historical figure. And that's why it's okay to fleetingly mention him. This feels almost like a less interesting switch of the movie The Man Who Sued God, which sees the Catholic Church having to prove God doesn't exist in order to not have to pay damages to Billy Connolly after his boat is struck by lightning, which is such a great plot for a movie.
And it's deemed an act of God, so that it will kind of ensure him, so he sues God. Yeah.
My problem with this nugget of brilliance, is that the realization that they have to prove Jesus was a real historical figure is introduced at the beginning of the third act, which I think would be the first thing you'd try.
Yeah, yeah,
right?
yeah.
Like in this argument. B, Jesus literally was a real guy, and I think most people know this. I don't think that was the debate. C, it's hardly the reason anyone is suing anymore, but anyone, because it's pulling on threads we already know. And D, none of this matters because the film still wants to establish the moral true north is that anyone should be able to talk about Jesus or preach or convert at any times because God is not dead and everyone needs to hear about this.
I do also, like, without sounding too sympathetic, I feel like I've already sounded far too sympathetic towards these movies, but and for a penny and for a pound, that I think, and this is again not knowing enough about America and what you guys fucking pledge allegiance to the flag every morning, and
So weird.
so weird.
So weird, man.
But the idea that a student can ask, like, oh, this is like what Jesus said, and that you can't go, yeah, exactly. That to me is fucked. Like, what are you supposed to respond if a student like, do you just I move that be stricken from the record,
yeah,
in your classroom? Yeah, I don't understand. I mean, I get that they dip into the argument that it's like the fact that you responded with scripture shows that you know more than the average person about Christianity, the Bible, whatever, and that counts as preaching. And so it's maybe yeah.
The reason you think this is fucked up, Richard, is because it's a gross misrepresentation of what would actually happen, right? So I agree that this film is better than the first film, if only because it's less bloodthirsty and cold. And it makes up for, but I think it makes up for this hatred by doubling down on this hilarious unrealistic persecution complex, because I think what you're saying, like, surely that's fine to just answer a question. I think the film outright lies to you with its premise because it has you side with Melissa Joan Hart because she's right. She did very innocently answer a question about Jesus from a historical perspective. But in real life and in real America, no one's going to court for this. They might get in trouble for actually proselytizing to students in a classroom, which is how everyone treats her. And I think this is because the film wants to have its cake and eat it too. They want it to be right, but they also want to depict the consequence of actually going too far, as if that were unfair. So it's misrepresenting the argument so that your side seems way more logical.
Yeah, right. So they needed her to explicitly preach.
But then she would be wrong and you wouldn't sympathize with her, so they can't show you that part. I've written a little analogy here, Richard. It would be like if I fucked a goat, right? And suffered through a legal battle about fucking a goat. And then I made a movie about this experience, but in the movie, I simply platonically cared deeply for a goat and suffered through the exact same legal battle as I did in real life. Someone watching this movie might go, wow, people who platonically care deeply for goats sure are unfairly persecuted. It's like, well, because this is actually the consequence for fucking a goat, not what she did.
As well, that the film ends with, like, this film is based on these court cases, and all of them end with this. And if you, like, on Wikipedia or IMDb, I saw that it says, like,
a lot of these court cases are not what the movie wants you to think
it says,
are.
like, it doesn't actually resemble any of the court cases. None of these actually happened. It's like, or I think it's the first film that says, it resembles these court cases, and it's like all of these court cases were thrown out because no one gives a shit.
Because no one gives a shit. And on top of all of that, the situation presented in the film, people have gone to court for things they've taught in schools, but do you know what that thing that they've taught in schools that they get taken to court for is?
Atheism.
It's evolution. Like, it is a reverse of what actually happens. In Nick Shager's review for the film from Variety, he writes, Harold Cronk's follow-up concocts a laughable crisis of faith whose resolution is a fait accompli, turning the endeavour into a torturous exercise in one-note proselytizing. And he continues, God's Not Dead 2 delivers copious back-and-forth arguments about separation of church and state that seem wholly divorced from any rational understanding of the topic. Instead, that subject is merely a flimsy pretext for a depiction of a tyrannical discrimination faced by Christians, as well as a fundamental legitimacy legitimacy of their views. So it's like, you're right, Christians, and look at this, look at what you have to suffer. Another review I found on Salon, written by Silpa Kovali, said, it is impossible to stress how deeply unrealistic the film's premise is, and important to stress that this case was not based on a true story, itself a loose specification. The movie suggests the persecution of Christians in our society is readily apparent in the real world and not just an artistic license. Then why on earth would its writers and producers have to invent such a case out of thin air rather than portraying one of the multitudes of victimless crimes for which Christians throughout the country are presumably being prosecuted? Perhaps because employees demanding contraceptive coverage or gay couples service might be more sympathetic than a fiendish ACLU lawyers. So basically like, hey, there are some court cases involving Christians having to do what they don't want to do that you might want to make a movie about, but those ones are how you don't want to, you're a minister that doesn't want to marry two gay people. Why don't you make a movie about that? Is it because Christians would obviously be the villains in that movie,
There is there's a couple of references to like homosexuality in these movies, isn't there?
There's reference as in like an atheist character giving like a straw man argument will list it among things that the church
I
doesn't
vaguely
like.
remember something in the first film, like a Christian character essentially being like, homosexuality is okay.
I don't think so. I highly doubt that is in the first
I
film.
can't remember.
Especially in 2014, when I feel like there was a lot more of a free thing you could say without getting in a lot more trouble than you could now. So also in this film, we've got the now healed of cancer left-wing blogger Amy from the first film, who ain't so left-wing anymore, and a background character from the first film named Martin, who's a Chinese student who was convinced to turn Christian at the end of the first film. He also returns, along with Reverend Dave and Reverend Jude, who further battle the government's insistence on controlling Christianity. Also starring in this film is Jesse Metcalfe, who plays Melissa Joan Hart's defense attorney. Ray Wise plays her prosecutor, and Ernie Hudson plays the judge, meaning the film stars alumni from, as you said, Sabrina the Teenage Witch, Desperate Housewives, Twin Peaks, and Ghostbusters, which is all a collection of media I can assure you corporate Christianity would have decried upon release. And there's also a TV show called Reaper, which I watched a bit of in high school, where Ray Wise literally plays Satan. So it's funny to see like all these people who are not only like, oh, it's a mainstream actor in a Christian film, but it's like the other things I've seen you in are very much not very, church friendly.
Yeah. Also, Jesse Metcalfe, I only know him from John Tucker Must Die, where he played the titular
the
Must
eponymous,
Die.
Which is actually a pretty similar title to God's Not Dead.
Yeah.
This movie should be called John Tucker's Not Dead. So another review I've got here is from Jordan Hoffman at The Guardian, who deemed it a much better movie than God's Not Dead, but that's a bit like saying a glass of milk left on the table hasn't curdled and is merely sour. And he further stated, it is unfortunately just professional enough that there are only brief instances of transcendent badness rather than drawn-out sequences. I love a good description of why a movie's bad. These eloquent, poetic... It's so great. As the sort of the Kevin Sorbo of this film in a lot of ways, I thought Ray Wise was so good in this movie as the prosecutor. Genuinely menacing, and he utters the best line in the franchise, which is, we'll prove once and for all that God is dead. And it's like, if you're going to include an atheistic straw man in your film, you could at least be a bit camp with it.
Yeah.
Why not? Get fun with it. Make him like a mustache twirling villain. Ray Wise has also appeared in X-Men First Class and RoboCop, by the way. So this is our third Ray Wise franchise.
The French Wise.
The real franchise. Jesse Metcalfe ends up winning the case for Melissa Joan Hart in the film by putting her on the stand after days of grueling discourse, which included questioning actual Christian apologists J. Warner Wallace and Lee Strobel, which is, I guess, this movie's equivalent to having the Duck Dynasty guy. Yeah. Both of whom look very giddy to be there and spout their actual teachings. They're not really acting. They're just like, why, yes, in my book you can read that.
That's so funny. I didn't even pick up on that.
No, maybe you don't know a Christian. You can't tell a Christian just by looking at them, whereas I can. like grey hair and that's the defining characteristic. After Melissa Joan Hart takes the stand, however, Jesse Metcalfe ruthlessly grills her into admitting she believes she hears from God, and in an emotional cataclysm which I don't think would actually change anyone's mind in real life, and probably get you thrown out of court, this convinces the jury to vote in favour of Melissa Joan Hart.
Yeah, so this was so fun. This was such a poor plot plot point that
They're trying to do a "you can't handle the truth" moment.
Yeah, I didn't even understand.
No, neither.
How he convinced them of anything.
Yeah, he's just a bad lawyer.
I was waiting the whole time for the "you can't handle the truth" moment or any kind of revelation, but he was just bullying her, and everyone goes, "Oh, okay." Yeah.
Oh, of course, God's not dead.
and then, yeah, Melissa Joan Hart comes off the stand, and I was like, "Why'd you do that?" And he's like, "I had to, so that they would see this." And she goes, "Now I get it." And explain it to me, please.
It's so funny to see a movie recreate like a trope, but not like just in the sense that the actors are reacting like the trope has been executed successfully, but the audience, like,
I think they were looking for a. I thought it was you walking through the door from Legally Blonde.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah. At the beginning of God's Not Dead 2, Richard, Melissa Joan Hart and her very elderly father exchange "I love yous." And they have this cute relationship that you see, fleetingly throughout the film. And he says, "I love you," as he's going to bed. He says, "I love you," and she says, "I love you better." And he looks at her and says, "I loved you first." And boy, did I think that would come up again later in the film as her father's last words on his deathbed. I guess that idea is just too smart for this movie. Yeah. Didn't it feel like it was setting that up? How good of a last word would "I loved you first" be?
And God. I loved you last.
And finally, there is a post-credit scene in this movie where Reverend Dave is arrested for refusing to comply with the government insisting to control the church. And the image of a financially comfortable white middle-class preacher being unfairly put in handcuffs, I think, is a microcosm for this whole franchise. Did you have any more thoughts, or shall we move on?
No, I think that leads us nicely into God's Not Dead, A Light in Darkness,
which came out in 2018. This was directed by Michael Mason, which is apparently a pseudonym for a guy named John Gunn. I don't know why he would need a pseudonym. Right. But what do you think this has on Rotten Tomatoes?
Probably 10% again.
10% again, with a 53% audience score. What is this movie about?
This one, we know which one has the 100% then.
This one drops the converging storyline kind of style and has more of a streamlined approach.
Yeah, this one, although in spite of that, I found this one the hardest to follow.
No, absolutely.
Yeah, it's so the David Hill gets out of prison, and the church he is reverend of fucking blows up. Yeah. So one of the students, it does though, right?
No, it does. Yeah.
Yeah. The one of the student the student is religious, right?
No, sorry. So there's a student couple. The girl is religious but questioning. The guy is atheist and wants her to just give it up, presumably so they can bang.
Yeah. So he blows up the church.
So he in a fit of religious angst, he spray paints a cross across the sign of the church, because the church is already being in trouble because they're refusing to comply with these
to hand over their sermons, right?
Yeah.
To be checked.
Yeah. And then he picks up a rock and he throws it through the window, aiming to just like break a window. But
instead, he hits a bomb that was inside the church and it blows up.
He hits a gas tank, which loosens the spout of the gas tank. Reverend Jude, who's been Reverend Dave's best friend for the whole series so far, goes in to investigate. Turns on the light and blows up and dies. So the rest of the film is basically the after a hate crime, what is perceived to be a hate crime, the
Mm.
university, which because it's a university church, the university board are like, we've got to remove the church from the university because this, this stuff is just going to keep happening, and this is no longer the place for religion. A university is no longer the place for religion. So to try and save the church, Reverend Dave gets his brother Pierce, played by John Corbett, to turn up, who's a lawyer, to try and defend
No
him.
relation to Jeremy.
No, but John Corbett is seemingly this film's big get, and makes his second appearance on film franchise Fortnights with this film, as he's probably more well known as playing Aidan from Sex and the City. And so he appears in Sex and the City 2. You'll also recognise him as the main guy from My Big Fat Greek Wedding.
Bold of you to assume I would recognise him from that.
Perhaps more significantly, though, is the appearance of Ted McGinley, who plays Thomas, the university board member and frenemy of Reverend Dave, who we've previously seen as villainous jock Stan Gable in the Revenge of the Nerds series.
Nice.
So we can add Revenge of the Nerds, Sex and the City, and sure, My Big Fat Greek Wedding to the extended list of media God's Not Dead actors have worked on, which would be condemned by the Christian community.
There's also Tatum O'Neill appears in this film, who is the youngest competitive Academy Award winner, who won an acting award at age 10 for her performance in Paper Moon, 1973.
Well, who does he play in this?
It's a woman, Barbara Solomon, board member of Hadley University.
Okay. Yeah, that's I Should Have Become Famous 30 years ago, but a Christian movie will be happy to have me kind of storyline.
Yeah, child actor who didn't quite transition. But you may as well continue with the plot.
So this film is loosely based on the story of 5 pastors in Texas who were issued subpoenas for sermons due to a potential violation of the Johnson Amendment, which says that non-profit organizations cannot announce a political allegiance, basically. But unlike in the film, in reality, the subpoenas were dropped. And since 2008, only one of more than 2,000 mainly evangelical clergy deliberately violating the law has been audited, and none were punished. This means that the entire crux of Reverend Dave getting arrested is Christians trying to illustrate this totalitarian dystopia they live in, where their religion is unfairly policed by the government. But in real life, the cases that inspired the story, the church won them. The church won those cases. They fell through. What are you complaining about? Like you can't be like, look what could happen, when we know it doesn't happen.
Yeah.
I mean, you can. That's called conservative rhetoric, I guess. That's the basis
persecution complex. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, so regarding this film, this was didn't like this film. I'll say I thought it was a significant drop off from the first two, and I like that I held the first two in like barely high enough esteem that there was room to go down, which is what I forced myself to do, because I wanted to not be like, these are all terrible. There is a hierarchy of God's Not Dead films. I did, however, I will say I thought it was interesting that they did stuff like have Reverend Dave like assault this college kid for murdering his black friend. Yeah. And it's like, these are all interesting, and it's interesting to see that you have the guy that owns the Pureflix production company playing the sort of the moral good Reverend Dave, and you see him, at his lowest point, and we actually kind of, obviously still within the bounds of a faith-based movie, we see kind of the depths of that, of him assaulting a kid, and
it's almost a compelling character arc, isn't it? It's so close.
It is, but it's like, if this was kind of a more coherent film, maybe if the Cronkman had directed it, this could be the best one.
Bring back Harold Cronk.
Because I think I like the idea, and also the dynamic of his brother being atheist is like, of course you do that, and it's like immediately kind of a fun dynamic, or it's like an interesting dynamic to write, I guess.
So the story in this one, I thought, fluctuated between deeply uninteresting. The Reverend Dave story is like, I don't want to watch a guy try to save a church. Like, it's so
Mm.
boring. And then also mind-numbingly miserable, because following the
Uh,
kid that accidentally killed Jude just made me feel sick and sad and like, oh my god, imagine if you
mm.
were in this situation. How horrible would that be? Considering Jude's death, though, being and it was caused by him switching on a light in a dark room and igniting the flame, igniting the gas. I can't help but feel that "A Light in Darkness" is a bit of an inappropriate subtitle for the film.
Yeah. It should have been like a light, one word.
Oh,
Mm.
oh, very dark. It feels like whoever wrote this film as well was a big Better Call Saul fan, and
Okay.
with the character of Pierce the lawyer doing like some kind of like dirty atheist tricks to try and get
Yeah,
stuff
yeah.
on his side. I thought it felt like they was trying to implement similar ideas from what I consider to be some of the best writing in television into some of the worst writing in movie history. My flatmate watching it with me was like, it's like if Better Call Saul was written by the worst writers in existence.
Yeah.
And in some ways, this one, I think, is simultaneously the least offensive and the most offensive.
Ooh.
It has nothing as brazen as killing off the atheist character and treating that like a victory, but it also feels like this one, and with the next one, they were trying to address some of the criticisms that have been leveled at the first two films, and
Mm.
because they fail at addressing these criticisms, it just makes it worse. So there's a scene where Reverend Dave's atheist brother, so Pierce, they're arguing, and Pierce brings up that Christians are always playing the victim card when they're also responsible for the world's greatest atrocities. So they're
Mm.
like, well, look, we're mentioning what you've criticized us for. There's another scene where Pierce is surprised to learn that Josh Wheaton, who returns in this film, was studying social justice law and jokingly calls him a liberal, to which Josh explains that Jesus was actually super feminist. And there's another scene where after a brick is thrown through the window, referring to the brick that flew through the window of the church, Reverend Dave visits Pastor Roland, an African American preacher from another church, and he basically says to him, "No offense, but I don't think you can understand what I'm going through right now." To which Roland explains that as a black preacher in the South, he's experienced this kind of oppression all the time. He's like, "Who do you think you're talking to now?" He says,
Yeah.
"I could build a church with the bricks that have been thrown through my window," which I
Mm.
thought was a good line.
Yeah.
This is all well and good. And while these are valid criticisms that are maybe worthy of addressing if you really want your film to stand on its own, the trajectory and criticized behaviors of the franchise still continue unchanged. And
Mm.
despite acknowledging, dipping a toe in concepts like white privilege and things, it is ultimately a story about a white kid who kills a black guy and then gets out of jail after barely doing any time because no one wants to mess up his future, because that's what happens to the guy that accidentally killed Jude.
Yeah.
Like, it's Kyle Rittenhouse. It's
Yeah.
one of those stories. It's
Mm.
just framed in a very strategic way that doesn't show you the people protesting that if a black guy had thrown a brick through a window and killed someone,
He'd be dead.
He'd be dead. Yeah. So the film acknowledges it has unconscious biases, but then it continues to show that it hasn't learned anything. It's just aware, it's just aware of the biases it was told about, and not the ones it still has.
Yeah.
On the scene where Reverend Dave is challenged by Pastor Roland for his own white privilege and ignorance, in a Variety article I would highly recommend for anyone interested in these movies called How the Christian Movie Series God's Not Dead Fails to Be Christian, Alison Wilkinson, who's a lifelong Christian herself, wrote, "In this moment and a few others, it seems like A Light in Darkness is about to reevaluate the God's Not Dead series' own narrative about Christians in America, one that's been far more interested in bolstering a certain sort of persecution complex than encouraging its audience toward Christian-like behavior. But in the end, this God's Not Dead installment is just like the others, putting on a pious face, but failing to imagine what real sacrifice looks like." She goes on, "It's telling that one African-American who challenges Dave's worldview is given very little airtime in God's Not Dead, because it encapsulates the insularity that keeps the white evangelical persecution complex humming. One wonders what would happen if God's Not Dead had chosen to engage with Roland Roland's story more? Or what if Dave actually had to acknowledge Roland's experience and learn from it, and thereby the audience? Or, even more daringly, what if God's Not Dead were telling Roland's story? There is no need to invent legal, social, and moral challenges for Roland. There's no need to fudge the truth there. There is history and evidence and reality, and it runs bone deep. Like, that's such a good way to put it. Like, it is telling that the God's Not Dead movies have to make up fictional court cases in order to appear subjugated, right? When there are real ones on the fringes of it that it ignores. It's because they want to be oppressed.
Do the people prosecuted because of the Don't Say Gay bill?
Yeah, exactly.
You wanted Christians.
There's another scene in this where Reverend Dave and Pierce are arguing about why their family fell apart when Pierce lost his faith. And Pierce says, "You all turned against me once I started asking some hard questions." And Dave says, "Is that what you call them? Hard questions? Asking why bad things happen to good people?" And I was like, that's a pretty low bar for what you consider like an unaskable hard question.
Yeah.
Like, if someone's questioning your faith, that's the first thing you'd ask. Like, you're a pastor. You should be prepared for this. And they act like that's like, you knew what you were doing. You were asking questions that were too hard. You're asking questions I don't know the answer to, and that's not fair.
Yeah, like, where's proof of God?
Yeah. And it's like, shut up and get out of the house. Do you have any more thoughts on God's Not
I think
Dead?
it's funny that Swayze is in this movie.
Who's that? I saw his name, but I didn't recognize him.
Yeah, he's Swayze was like a one-hit wonder, a two-hit wonder actually. That in the late 2000s, probably like 2009ish, he had a song called "Buzzin'." That was like, yeah, she was buzzing out over me, and then he had a song called "Corona and Lime."
Oh, that's not very Christian.
Yeah, and just completely disappeared, but then I guess resurfaced and appeared in this movie as one of Thomas's friends.
It is so funny the pedigree of actors that end up in this movie, right? Like, it is always, it's never like currently famous people. It's people who were famous a long time ago. Yeah. All right. Well, with that, we can move on to the fourth film and currently final film in the franchise called God's Not Dead, We the People. This came out last year in 2021 and is directed by someone named Vince Null. It doesn't have a critic score.
Vance Null.
Vance Null. It doesn't have a critic score, but it does have 100% audience score on Rotten Tomatoes.
From like over 250 reviews as well.
And what is this movie about?
So this one is about a group of parents, led by Reverend Dave.
Who's not a parent, interestingly enough.
Yeah, who they're homeschooling their children, and then a social services woman shows up unannounced and is horrifically offended that they are talking about Noah and whatnot, and then so they have to go to court they say you have 10 days to stop talking about Jesus, or they have to go to real school. And so they go to Washington, D.C. to testify in front of a congressional subcommittee on homeschooling. And I love this on Wikipedia. The ends the plot synopsis. Much of the last half of the film consists mainly of long speeches by the parents, pastor, and members of Congress over the topic of homeschooling. Does kind of fall apart in the second half. But yeah, there's a funny thing in this where she's like, there's just the one moment that stuck out to me when the social services woman comes in and she goes, "And who are you?" to Reverend Dave Hill, and he's like, "Oh, I'm Reverend Dave Hill," and she's like, and cuts him off like as if to say, "Who asked you?" And it's like, you literally just asked who he was, and he tells you, and you're so offended that he answered. And just to really prove how evil this character is.
This film also stars William Forsythe as the villain. He's Senator Robert Benson, and we've seen William Forsythe before on film franchise Fortnights in Rob Zombie's Halloween, where he threatens to skullfuck someone
Nice.
and is murdered by Michael Myers after he calls him gay. So we can add Halloween to the list of God's Not Dead related media the church wouldn't approve of, but probably more because it's about Halloween than it being homophobic.
Yeah.
What did you think of this one, Richard? What did you think of God's Not Dead, We the People?
Well, also just in reference to actors past and homophobia, Isaiah Washington, who's plays, what's the character's name? Daryl Smith, the congressman who helps Dave. He was he landed his breakthrough role on Grey's Anatomy, but he was dismissed after the third season due to his use of a homophobic slur while referring to cast member T.R. Knight.
Wow.
Yeah,
that's
so
who you get in your movie.
That's something probably the church would support.
It's such a bad look. Why would they do that? It's such a bad look for a movie.
Well, no, so see, this is like, imagine if this was what it was about. It's like based on the true story of Isaiah Washington. That it's like he kicked out for being conservative because he, called someone the F slur.
No, this movie would say it would be because he chose not to go and drink alcohol with them. But in real life, it's because he said the F slur. It's the goat fuck thing again.
Yeah.
So did you like this one?
I didn't. No. It was,
really?
It was bad. Yeah, but again, it's
missing that Kronk touch.
It is, and it is funny that the how distinctive of a drop off there is, and it's the Kronkman, baby. That's just the Kronk style.
Yeah,
but this it does have one really good cut in it. There's a moment where Reverend Dave is talking to his deceased friend Jude. That's his name, right? Yeah. Yeah, who comes and sort of tells him to, fucking believe in God or whatever.
It's like a flashback to before he died.
And then it has this shot where it's shot in profile and it's kind of a silhouette shot of Dave where there's like a big light coming from the other side of his head and, it almost illuminating him with like a halo or an ethereal
a
glow.
divinity almost.
Yeah. And then it match cuts to real time and he's sitting alone in his office and instead of this divine glow, it's raining at night outside. And I was like, messaged you, and I said, I'm sorry, dude, that's good filmmaking. that cut, that's good filmmaking.
Don't even remember it happening.
Yeah, it could be in Avengers Endgame. That's in a real film.
I thought this movie was maddening. I thought because it's not even really about God anymore, it basically replaces Christianity as its central concept with homeschooling or being American, two things that this movie would seemingly like to put forward as fundamental tenets of Christianity. Like if you were watching the first three films and you were lost because you're not a Christian, you'll be lost watching this one if you aren't American or homeschooled or a homeschool teacher. Like it's so weird that it goes like we are taking this stand because like there are so many Christians that aren't American, and probably the majority of them don't homeschool their kids worldwide, right? So, like, it's such a weird stance to take. It's a weird hill to die on, I might say, which is a line of dialogue in the film which Reverend Dave says to William Forsythe's character, Senator Robert Benson, and Robert Benson says it to him. He says, "Is this really the hill you're willing to die on?" And Reverend Dave responds with, "This, my belief started because a man died on a hill." And it's like, that is what the turn of phrase is referencing.
Right.
You're not being clever by connecting those two things. When someone says, "Would you die on a hill for it?" they're making a Christ reference. Like,
I didn't know that.
Didn't you? Oh, okay.
No, I don't give a shit about religions.
I would assume it's a Christ reference, considering what dying on a hill for something means. Like, yeah. In case you're wondering as well, the film isn't based on any real-life attack on homeschooling, and the franchise is just, once again, fear-mongering based on a threat that isn't actually real or even looming. Like, there isn't a discourse around this. This is, I think, them looking at disagreeing with public education and facilitating a story in which public education can be like a literal
Yeah,
boogeyman.
yeah.
You know.
I will say I found the most disappointing thing for me about this film is, so this came out in 2021. It'd be one of the probably the most recent film we've covered on the podcast.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That the yeah. So as I mentioned earlier, the poster for this film is a silhouette of a person looking out at that reflection pool that leads to the Washington Monument, and it's called "We the People." And I guess in my head, I associated it with the Purge election year. That like this late sequel to a franchise that's about politics, and it, like the fact that it came out almost exactly a year after Donald Trump lost the 2020 election. In my head, I assumed this was going to be not like the other films are bad. This one is dangerous. And it's about a man running for office and trying to, the Christian beliefs that Donald Trump himself famously upholds. And that it was going to be this kind of film. And I was really excited to watch that offensively, dangerously bad movie, and instead it's like homeschooling is the biggest threat facing America. And there's a line in this film where they're talking about we're all we the people, which but they're saying I should be able to decide which immunizations my children get, and it's that's not a line you should have in a 2021 film.
I mean, it isn't a Christian one, right? They are pandering to an audience,
yeah, exactly,
of America. In this one, as I said, it doubles down on the American aspect of it. But yeah, there is a moment in this film where someone actually mentions it's because they meet with other homeschoolers who don't want homeschool to be governed for non-religious reasons. And so one of them is that they want to be able to choose the vaccines or which vaccines their children get.
Yeah. They also reference flat Earth in the film.
Yep, there's one of my favorite lines of this movie is my child believes the Earth is round. That's a fuck you moment to the.
It's so funny that it's because I imagine would there be a lot of crossover between flat Earth and Christianity? I assume both flat earthers and Christians are fucking stupid and believe the same things. But
the flat Earth movement is inherently Christian,
right? Yeah,
it is based in Christianity.
Yeah, I thought it was a weird thing to have your character be they just think we're a bunch of flat earthers, and I was a lot of people will be walking out of the 3-night theatrical engagement of this film.
Also in that scene where there are other homeschoolers who talk about why they want to keep homeschool, and for non-religious reasons, there's a black couple who matter-of-factly, they're all adding reasons why they want, and a black couple matter-of-factly add, not to mention institutionalized racism.
Yeah.
And it made me guffaw. The franchise learnt a new buzzword, and maybe it'll catch the ears of the skeptics watching, oh wow, they know about it. They know about institutionalized racism. Maybe that means the movie's getting better. There's also a scene in which, the Congressman Garrel, who's Isaiah Washington's character, who is black, if you didn't know, is explaining to Reverend Dave how hard it will be to try win the case, and is basically shit-talking public education in comparison to homeschooling, and insists that public schools are trying to instill anti-American sympathies in children by saying that the founding fathers were all a bunch of old men who owned slaves. And he goes to defend the founding fathers by explaining that they were all between the relatively young ages of 23 and 35, and, quote, not all of them owned slaves. And it's unfair to paint them all with the same brush. And I thought this was so hilariously pointed because it's a really wishy-washy defense of the slave owner thing. And it asks more questions, I think, than so which ones owned slaves? Surely that should matter, which ones owned slaves and which ones didn't. But it demonstrates how God's Not Dead continuously doesn't understand the argument it's having. Doesn't understand what the other side are actually saying. Because the issue that I, for example, have with considering the founding fathers' ideas, perfect and they don't need to be
Infallible,
changed,
yeah.
infallible. The reason I disagree with that is not because they were under 35 years old. It's because their ideas and beliefs were influenced by the time around them, and these ideas and beliefs are often imbued with troubling racist or sexist sympathies. I could care less if they were my age. Of course they were my age. That's not the part I'm worried about,
Yeah, the like, yeah, like sexism and racism would be a lot less of a problem if it wasn't for religion. I think, like these ideas that the church is finally getting around to being like, all right, I guess you're people too, like that. Yeah, I think would be a lot further along as a society if it wasn't for religion as a concept. Also, the other thing that's interesting that you just reminded me of as well is that the first film has the argument of like, if you're not Christian, what's stopping you from murdering people or doing horrible things? Which is like, it's such a terrifying argument.
Christians are sitting there rumbling, wanting to go murder someone.
Yeah, that's the thing. It's like, I'm glad you have Christianity. There's like Penn Jillette said in an interview talking about it. He said, "I have raped and murdered every single person I want to in life, which is none." Like, it's insane that, and it's a really scary thought that it means that Christians have these intrusive thoughts and the only reason they're not acting on them is because of Jesus. And I mean, it's a commonplace thing now to talk about this argument. I mean, Steve Harvey loves mentioning where is your moral barometer? But yeah, it's the same sort of thing. I think of why a lot of like anti-gay Christians end up coming out as gay, because they think that everyone has these gay thoughts and they're the only ones that are strong enough to suppress them. And it's like, no, gay people have gay thoughts.
Yeah, I agree. And I think like the franchise, it throws around these concepts that people criticize it for so often. It uses words like false narrative or institutionalized racism to try and show it's aware of arguments made against American Christianity, but it catastrophically fails to even understand what these ideas are with the same tenacity as all the now very affirmed Christians who are watching these movies. More so, I found myself emphatically agreeing with all the atheist characters' points. There's a part after the social worker comes to the homeschool where she's like, so the lesson for today's for the message of today's lesson is obey God or die, because they're talking about Noah's Ark. And the woman's like, not exactly. And then the film moves on, but it's like, she's right. Everyone's problems with Christianity in this movie are correct. You should like.
I will say, as a like, even I know that these stories aren't meant to be interpreted literally. They're parables, they're allegories.
Christians don't know that. So it depends on the Christian. That's a big divide in the Christian community.
Sure.
Over whether these stories literally happened or not.
I think there's a reference in the first film where they're like, it says this in the Bible, this is what it means, kind of thing. And it's like, not everything I think is supposed to be interpreted literally, you'd hope not. Or that like, this is what, or it might be the second one that's like, this is what probably literally happened, but, or like when he says this in the Bible, it's when they're talking about how you can use multiple people's accounts of things to confirm a truth. And he's talking about all this sort of stuff and how reading between the lines and stuff like that. That's like, I get that Noah's Ark isn't supposed to be obey God or die. It's like about, I don't know what fucking other shit it's about, but it's like,
that's about it.
Yeah, but sure, maybe I'm wrong. But I've also just discovered fun thing here. I'm talking about this movie. So Antonio Sabato Jr., who plays one of the parents wishing to homeschool their children, he's a blacklisted actor because in 2016 he endorsed Donald Trump for president, and on Twitter said that he was blacklisted from Hollywood after expressing support for Trump, and compared a struggle to find work as being Jewish during the Holocaust, and said that people had been mocking him. But you know what? He still managed to find work, and God's not dead for it.
Aisha, who is the Muslim turned Christian character from the first
Nice.
film, returns in this, where she is swiftly T-boned by a truck, and goes into a coma, prompting her disillusioned father, who kicked her out of house and home in the first film when he found out she was Christian. He comes back into her life to care for her in her comatose state and maybe find Jesus. He maybe also finds Jesus.
It's so funny, the idea that it's like, my daughter accepted Jesus Christ as her Lord and Savior and then was swiftly T-boned. Maybe there's something to this Jesus thing.
Not only does the information of Aisha's accident seemingly never reach her friends who have road tripped out to Washington DC and are never told and never react to it. Like
There's
Martin,
like
who's the
that,
Chinese guy, he's in this film always like spewing out these weird like pro-American ideas, and he's like texting her throughout the start of the film, and they're like friends, and then she gets put in a coma, and you just don't see the characters respond to this information at any point in the film.
Yeah, I wanted to see Joss Whedon respond to Kevin Sorbo's death.
It's so weird. They just ignore these things because they're too hard.
Absolutely, it needed to.
Yeah. Also, I don't know if you noticed this, how much attention you're paying to the movie. She's still in a coma at the end of the movie.
Yeah.
The credits abruptly start rolling, and she presumably never wakes up. At least with the canon we have now.
Well, let's hope for a fifth film.
And I like that the message here to young Christians who have maybe been abandoned by their families for their faith is just like, just get in a car accident. That'll make your family forgive you. Like, that's the practical advice the movie is giving out. Steve Pulaski from Influx magazine wrote a review for this film titled "God's Not Dead, We the People" is a repugnant film to its very core, where he describes the film as being not merely the worst in an already misbegotten series, but so utterly deplorable that its status as a 3-night-only Fathom event in theatres at least assures that significantly fewer people will see it. At one point, a character justifies homeschooling their child because it protects them from receiving some immunizations. This is a hellscape in which we live. The article he wrote also goes on to talk about like there was one other group of people in the theater with him, and they were like clearly like really enjoying it. And they said that after it finished, the guy turned to him and was like, "What'd you think?" And he said, "You don't want to know." I agree with Steve Pulaski that this is the worst one, and if only because of how sickeningly American it is compared to the others, which is still like inherently jingoistic, but this one is like they don't understand that Christians exist outside of America and don't have American values in it. I really loathe that idea that like American values are inherent to Christianity, because that's based in nothing, you know. And I think in a way that makes it seem like they just think Christians like are like this everywhere, and like the film constantly masturbates over the USA and the Constitution and various amendments.
Constitution's stupid.
That has characters moved to tears looking at various Washington memorials and monuments, and ends with
a character be offended that they called them like attractions or something.
Right, yeah. I mean, it ends with an impassioned speech from Reverend Dave about how it is an American right to teach Noah's Ark in school instead of anything that's actually helpful. And then the film just ends with what feels like several storylines still hanging. I thought, like, it's a weird.
But everyone claps, and it's like you can't do that.
The movie implies like they won the case, even though it was a David and Goliath situation, you know, and they just leave you to believe that this worked. But with how proud to be American this movie is, it makes me wish I could revisit the humble second film in the series, Richard. And I wish I was a student in Melissa Joan Hart's class when she's making her scandalous comparisons between Jesus and Martin Luther King Jr. And just put up your hand and be like, how did Martin Luther King die? See if God's not dead. They'll acknowledge how Jesus died. How did Martin Luther King die? Oh, was it the fucking FBI killed him because that's America? Any more thoughts on God's Not Dead, We the People?
It's bad. On the series as a whole, I want to come out officially and say they are bad.
Okay.
I think that. Like, I don't know, it's interesting. If the first two was just like a duology of like these films that like there's nothing in them if you're not Christian, I could be like, I'm quite happy for there to be films that aren't for me, and they're bad. Outside of this podcast, I never would have watched them. I don't think they're necessarily like evil films in the sense like they're
I think they're
masturbatory
evil.
Christian films. Like, I mean, okay, if you think Christianity is evil, they're
No,
obviously
no,
evil.
I don't
But
necessarily. I just think these are hateful. They present a superiority to American Christians.
yeah, well, the first two especially are like, you could watch this as a Christian and be like, oh, it's nice to see a movie where Christianity wins for once. And it's like, if you're brainwashed fully in the Christian faith, you can have a movie or two like that. It's when you get into the third and fourth movie where I'm like, these are bad. These are bad for you, even if they're what you believe. And but all four of them are bad. They're maybe not as fun bad as I would have hoped, but I don't want to have to come out on the Discord in the following week when people be like, actually, Richard really seemed to like these movies, but I didn't. I just this is what it sounds like when I pay more attention to the films than usual, and I have more to say about them. I think interesting films, and yeah, I'm glad we watched them.
Well, other people also watch these films with us, Richard, because if you join our Cult Elder tier on Patreon, what that means is you're given access to a secret Discord channel where you can give us your thoughts on the film, and we will read out your thoughts. So this is our Cult Elders section for those of you guys that watched God's Not Dead. Bliss, my Dog's Not Dead is his name this week, says, gotta admit that as a kid going to Catholic school, the titular song God's Not Dead was far and away the best song they played at church. I remember the first film coming out. I was rather curious how they turned the song into a film, but lo and behold, it was another song with the same lyrics. Imagine my vague disappointment. I actually never saw the first film, but I will say that I embarrassingly thought that the raging atheist teacher was J.K. Simmons. I think I confused Whiplash with this film. Whoops, was this a somewhat understandable mistake, or am I a heathen?
They came out at the same time, but oh my god, if
Kevin Sorbo was in Whiplash.
Yeah, like swap the characters, like no, but like keep the character like Terrence Fletcher from Whiplash as the teacher in God's Not Dead.
My thoughts on the first film are really that the premise is silly and absurd from a conceptual standpoint while taking itself too seriously, and it hurts the film so much. I did, however, get to watch the second film. And I will say that the three leads did a really good job. Melissa Joan Hart was cool to see in anything, but the defense lawyer played by Jesse Metcalfe did a fantastic job in his role. It would have been really easy to phone it in, but I felt like he gave it his all in his performance. The prosecuting lawyer dude was cartoonishly evil, and it was enjoyably absurd to see him connive around. Note that I don't think the actual script was any good, very similar to what you just said, Richard. But the actors really seemed to be having fun, and it felt genuine. Ridiculously stupid movie or not, there's something wholesome about that. As for the content, yeah, it's pretty damn stupid. Even after switching to public school years later, the teachers talked about Jesus every now and then. It was never disallowed. Teachers were openly willing to invite us to prayer club, which I was a part of, and I saw several of them at church at different times. I was in a debate club as well, and surprised Jesus was brought up fairly regularly there as well. On top of that, the film was cringe and stupid at times, possibly racist as well. Note that the discussion about Martin Luther King and how he was a reverend is primarily directed at an African-American character with another African-American character in frame for no other reason than to make a point. I don't think that would be an accident. The film seems to disgustingly imply that if an African American isn't completely familiar with Martin Luther King's teachings, then they are ignorant or blasphemous. I'll admit I skipped around, but I got the gist. The story is confused as to what the trial is actually about, that she talked about Jesus or that Jesus existed or whether or not God is dead. The legal stuff makes absolutely no sense. For example, it's a civil case that has a jury for some reason.
Great point.
And the more I think about it, the stupider it gets. At risk of rambling too much more, sure I'll leave it at that. And then he says, I like the line at the end with the lawyer's assistant lady saying the evil lawyer proved the existence of Jesus Christ. If so, that kind of breaks the need for the rest of the franchise, yes? If it's been proven in court and universe, the legal precedent has been set, why do the conflicts continue in the sequels, which I did not watch? Props watching the stereotypical bad movie dance party ending they managed to cram in there, really the cherry on top. And then Paul Hill offered their thoughts as well. They said, I watched the first film as it's on Amazon Prime here. My laptop died halfway through, so maybe that was a sign. As a film, I was surprised by how technically competent it was. A couple of actors were a bit shaky and the music was overbearing at times, but I've certainly seen worse produced films. It was also effective at delivering its message to its target audience, even if it's not going to stand up to much scrutiny from non-hardcore Christians. I'm not sure if the filmmakers would care about that, as the movie is more saying, well done on being right, rather than a tool for conversion. Honestly, I'm a bit jealous of people who genuinely believe this stuff. Religiously, I'm more of a hope theist. It'd be nice if there was some sort of grand plan, everything made sense at some level, and there was an eternal paradise after death. To me, that just seems highly unlikely.
I find that very relatable, that sort of take on religion, that it's, maybe not so much these days, but like I have, in the past been like, God, it'd be so comforting to believe in this stuff, but...
Oh, sure. I mean, as an ex-Christian, I sometimes miss having like a final...
A reason to live.
Well, no, like a final ace card, like an ace in my pocket. That's what I'm trying to say.
But like, also, if God is in heaven is real, wouldn't you want to die?
Well, according to Reverend Dave, when he's comforting dying Kevin Sorbo, yes.
Yeah. I guess that's why they'd be like, but you can't kill yourself.
Finally, for my birthday, please vote Fred, which is Dan's account. They said, really wish I had joined a watch along because I find extremely and explicitly Christian films really hilarious, especially when they pretend they're a marginalized group. I was raised Catholic, so I was pretty oblivious to the Protestant arm of the propaganda machine, and it's like peeking into a whole other world with Pure Flix films and adjacent studios. They know what a movie looks like, but it's executed with the most clunky dialogue plot and entirely void of subtlety or nuance.
I like the line. They know what a movie looks like. They look like movies. They're over 90 minutes. They're the shots. There's one really nice cut.
All right, so our final big sort of segment for our Gods Not Dead episode, Richard, is Continue the Franchise, where we pitch our continuations of the franchise. As far as actual continuations go, doesn't look like there's anything on the cards as of yet, but hey, God works in mysterious ways, and you never know what's going to be announced 3 weeks before it drops in cinemas for a limited 3-day run. So I would expect there probably will be a God's Not Dead 5, and we can only, to quote the title of another Christian movie, I can only imagine what horrors will unfold in that one.
What's the title?
I can only imagine.
Really?
Yeah. What?
I
what's
thought
your...
you emphasized horrors so much. I thought that was something to do with it. I was like, that seems odd for a Christian film.
This is very dark.
Yeah. So I've got 2 continued franchises.
Okay.
Because I dibsed one at the start of the week and then didn't use it. So Godzilla's Not Dead. This is one of mine that so the idea, I would like the idea that it's one of the classic Godzilla ones where it's a sequel, ignores all sequels, sequel to the first one, and many people in the close to 70 years since Godzilla first attacked have come to believe that it actually wasn't real. It was a parable for the nuclear bomb dropped on Hiroshima, but it was but then there's a group of people, or a person specifically, that believes that Godzilla was real and he's still around, and then of course plot would happen.
Oh, a bit of plot.
My second idea, because I initially I was like, I want to do an actual continue the franchise that meets the film on its terms, and it's like, if I was David A.R. White, what would be an actual idea I could come up with for the 5th film? I sort of started to do that and then took it in a silly direction. So this one's called God's Not Dead, Missionary Impossible. And this is about Reverend Dave, our old mate Dave, obviously has to be in it, travels to the remote island of North Sentinel Island off the coast of India, which is the home to the Senegalese. This is a real island. The indigenous people and who they're essentially shut off from the world. They've got they're like protected, and they're these primitive people who have never made contact with the outside world. People have gone to them. A couple of years ago, a missionary went to try and convert them to Christianity. I think it was Christianity, was it? Yeah, and was killed because and the law essentially states like, yeah, you're gonna die if you try to go there, and you shouldn't have gone there, and there's so I want to see David A.R. White travel to the island. However, I would love to see him convert them to Christianity against all odds, and it'd be like it's based on the real, because he would get there, and but I'm so fascinated by that island that it'd be so fascinating if we could somehow actually study them up close, and how the tales of because there've been attempts to contact them, like, and they've been fishermen or boats have gone close by and they've been attacked, and it'd be interesting to see, to know, like, the boogeyman they tell them their kids about is probably the white man that tries to convert them to Christianity.
Very nice. My Continue the franchise is similarly based off, in style of both what you did and the movies themselves. It is based off a true story, and I was trying to think of like what would actually compel me, what would actually interest me in a God's Not Dead movie, and so I'm pitching you God's Not Dead Civil War. And what this movie is about is much like what's happening with Hillsong Church at the moment. Let's say a significant figure in global Christianity is outed as being a sex pest, or is basically cancelled.
He wouldn't.
It follows Reverend Dave as he like grapples with the like sort of the bastion of Christianity that is this movie's version of Hillsong. Like, what happens to church all over the world when such an important figure is outed as being a terrible person. I think that would be legitimately very interesting. I think that's a way where you can actually kind of get away with the navel gazing that God's Not Dead is famous for, because it is about looking in and not looking out, which is what all the other movies are. So yeah, that's what I want to see. I want to see God's Not Dead Civil War, where a famous pastor is cancelled for sex crimes.
Nice.
And that is our episode, I think, of God's Not Dead. The only thing we have left to do now, Richard, is rank that franchise.
Yay,
so
this might be contentious.
This might be contentious. So I'm going to head on over to letterboxd.com, and we have a list on our Letterboxd where we rank every franchise we've ever watched, and we're going to presumably, I'm hoping we can at least agree that we'll be ranking
which half
God's
of
Not Dead in the lower half of the ranking. I'll concede, like, it's maybe not as much of a slam dunk of a gold star franchise as I maybe initially thought, which is what when we each movie is as good as each other. But here's what I'm thinking for God's Not Dead's placement, right? Our bottom three films are the Medea films. Represented by films. Our bottom three franchises are Diary of a Mad Black Woman, so the Medea films, The Scorpion King, and Dungeons and Dragons. I think this is worse. I think this is maybe not as bad as Dungeons and Dragons, but I think it's worse than Scorpion King and Medea.
I'm glad we're with each other on Dungeons and Dragons, because I thought I was going to have to fight you to keep it out of the last spot. Not because I don't think it should deserve the last spot, but because I think Dungeons and Dragons is so much worse than this. With Scorpion King, at least you have that like one of them's a real film.
Yeah, and with Medea, you have Medea's witness protection.
Yeah, which is amazing.
Very, like, interesting moments, I think.
And Land Before Time, the first one, at least a lot of people like. But yeah, I think second to last is a
where is Land Before Time on our ranking?
It's third to last.
Oh, is my screen all funny?
The last four are Medea, Land Before Time, Scorpion King, Dungeons and Dragons.
Cool. So we're going to place it at 149 out of 150. So this is actually the 150th franchise we've watched, which I wasn't aware of. And what we're going to do now is over on Patreon, our patrons have been suggesting and voting on which franchise we're going to be doing next. And it sounds like, based on what I've heard most recently, like we're going to be going from the second worst franchise we've ever watched to maybe the third worst franchise. Is that true?
So this has been a very contentious poll. I've got a lot of comments, and we had like as early as as recent as a couple of hours ago, we had like a 7-way tie. So now I need to just carefully go through and double check.
Well, while you're doing that, I will just let people know that if you enjoyed this episode of Film Franchise Fortnights on the Cult Popture podcast, it is actually very easy to support us. And you can do that either by following us on Instagram or Twitter at Cult Popture, or you can jump in our Discord where a lot of all of our planning and all our community live. Or if you want to throw some financial support our way, you can head over to patreon.com/cultpopture where you can do things like suggest and vote on franchises we cover, or you get exclusive podcasts over there, all sorts of yummy stuff. So head on over there if you want, or you can email us at cultpopturemedia@gmail.com. But until next time, Richard, what is our next franchise?
So our next franchise is a trilogy, and it is famously possibly the worst film franchise ever made, which I doubt.
It's the God's Not Dead or Dungeons and Dragons.
It's the Fred franchise, which it's the lowest rated film franchise or trilogy, at least on Letterboxd, consisting of Fred the movie, Fred 2, Night of the Living Fred, and Fred 3, Camp Fred. With this is Camp Fred that it was. This is one that's been suggested many times, and there's been a lot of campaigns fought valiantly. Mostly by Dan, who we're recording this on his birthday, so there you go, Dan. Happy birthday.
And I believe Fred 3, Camp Fred, will be our 666th film that we've watched for the podcast, which is very fun in a way.
Which, if we'd known we were approaching, we would have made God's Not Dead.
All right, everybody. Well, thank you for listening, and stay tuned for the post-credit scene at the end of this episode after the music stops. But other than that, thank you for listening. Let us know your thoughts on God's Not Dead. Or is he? Is he surely alive?
Let us know if you think God is dead or not.
Alrighty, welcome along to the post-credit scene. This is a segment at the end of each episode where if you donate $5 or more to us over at patreon.com/cultpopture, you get to give us something to talk about in the post-credit scene. Richard, who's it from and what is it this week?
This question comes to us from Ian Sterner, who writes, with films sometimes taking longer to release in New Zealand than other countries, has there ever been a film, or do you think there ever could be a film that you couldn't bear to wait for and would travel to another country to see? If so, what film was it, or what would it hypothetically be? This is a really interesting question. It's there. I remember Rowan Strang of the film of the Cult Popture family travelled to Melbourne, I believe, to see Interstellar, because it opened a night earlier and it was playing in IMAX there, and we only have one IMAX cinema in New Zealand. It's not actually technically an IMAX cinema, it's just got a real big fucking screen that's real loud. And I remember before so I hadn't seen the movie yet, and he posted his review was something along the lines of like, wow, need to take some time to process or something like that, and it was like, oh, he didn't like it. And then I didn't like it either. But I think he does actually like it. And then, actually, funnily enough, I watched Interstellar, didn't like it, and then when I went to Melbourne several years later for a holiday, and they happened to be playing Interstellar on that same IMAX, and I thought, I'll go again and see it in the best possible way. And I was like, there's a lot of stuff in this that I liked that I'd forgotten was in there because I hated the rest of it so much. Anyway, the answer to the question, I think these days with like films going to streaming a lot quicker, and I've never been like a massive person in terms of like, I need to see this in IMAX or like on the biggest screen possible. But I do, my main motivation for going to the cinema over watching a film at home is knowing that I'll be forced to pay more attention to it.
Yeah,
I
exactly.
think there is things like if I was long overdue for a holiday and I was thinking about going to Melbourne or wherever, and Australia was getting a film before us, I would probably safely time it, but it would be more about I would want to see it in IMAX just because it's a fun experience every now and then, but it's not something that I would specifically travel to a country for. But it's I would not super coincidentally be in the country at the same time if it, fortune favored the bold for that.
Yeah, I can't imagine, like, some of the best films I've ever seen have been on my TV with no speakers, like bad speakers.
With
like,
no speakers?
Well, no, I technically, the speakers in
Yeah.
the TV, I don't have external speakers is what I mean. And so, like, I don't think there would be a movie I would go for the sole reason overseas to see. But when COVID first started happening, you and I and Rowan made what we knew at the time were probably doomed plans to go see Tenet in IMAX in Melbourne, and we bought really cheap flights, knowing we probably wouldn't be able to go.
It was return flights were free.
Yeah, and
because this was when COVID wasn't really a threat, and they were like, "Hey, flights are cheap."
Yeah. So in that sense, yeah, like I would have gone, but it wouldn't have even been to the premiere, so I probably would have already seen it. And it's more like I wouldn't go overseas just because a movie was playing over there. But if people wanted to go overseas, and one of the things we would do is watch a movie.
Yeah, I mean, I was overseas. I was in Thailand when The Force Awakens came out, and it was very much like we have to factor going the night it comes out into our plans. But then, yeah, I mean, like if Endgame didn't come out here for another 2 weeks after the States, I might be looking at like I would say Endgame would be probably the closest thing in terms of a movie that I had to see that day.
Sure. Nice.